Circling back to the big story we're tracking, Israel has widened its offensive on Gaza as it resumes ground operations across the enclave. The Israeli military also kept up airstrikes, which began earlier this week, despite calls from global leaders to preserve the ceasefire, which began in January. Defense Minister Israel Katz issued what he calls a last warning to residents of Gaza, telling them to ensure the return of hostages and remove Hamas from power or face complete destruction. Now, earlier this morning, we spoke to Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former advisor to the Israeli government. And he told us what possibly went into the calculation to end the ceasefire now after 2 months.
We have to look for an explanation outside of the operational theater, if you like. But one of the things, by targeting it just at the time of the pre-dawn Ramadan, Sahur morning, pre-morning even meal, was that they knew that there were certain people would be in certain places, but they also, I'm sure, could anticipate that there would be a very high civilian toll, and could certainly anticipate the way this would play out across so much of the Muslim world, people looking with religious sensibilities at what was being done at this time in the calendar year. But why from the Israeli side did it happen now? I think you have to look in two places. One, which has been the case throughout this, see it through the lens, not so much of what brings security or what brings the Israeli hostages home, but what works for the personal political calculation of a prime minister who needs to keep a coalition going and has set out his stall as the indispensable wartime leader in that respect. And it's not cynical to suggest this. This is exactly what the families of so many of the Israelis still being held are saying. They're saying this is for the personal political interest of the prime minister. He had 12 days left to pass the budget. He has a wafer-thin majority. By conducting this strike, he strengthened his coalition, and a lot of his immediate political problems evaporated. The second place to look is, how did Netanyahu assess his maneuver room with the U.S. administration? And if he made the calculation correct, it almost certainly seems that he had the green light from the administration. That was confirmed in later statements by the White House.
Yeah. And Daniel, Mr. Netanyahu declared that this is just a beginning. But given Israel's previous challenges in eliminating Hamas, what are the chances of successfully achieving that goal now?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't think the answer is that those chances increase exponentially. We did, as you're suggesting here, see 16 months where there was no restraint on the Israeli side. It wasn't that they didn't have the weaponry or the intent or the desire. It wasn't that they were tiptoeing between the raindrops of what one can do. 60,000 people were killed. There is an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court against the Israeli Prime Minister and his former defense minister for the way they conducted this war. They are being tried, the state of Israel, for plausibly committing the crime of genocide at the International Court of Justice, at which provisional measures were called for. And yet, amidst all the death, horror, destruction, starvation, prevention of humanitarian assistance, Hamas was not militarily defeated. And the broader public in Gaza did not run away, leave the territory. They showed resilience and steadfastness. There's not much to suggest that it would look different militarily this time around. As I said, this almost certainly puts the lives of the Israelis still being held there at greater risk. And so I think you have to look elsewhere, not in the realm of likely achievable military goals, but in the realm of politics, in the realm of ideology, in the realm of what can we get away with.
We know Israel consulted the U.S. on these strikes. The White House has put the blame solely on Hamas for the resumption of these hostilities. So what does that tell us? What does Washington's position indicate now about how much space Netanyahu has to maneuver, as you put it, and where will White House support go from here?
Here, I think we have to pause for a moment at least, and just acknowledge that there's a not insignificant element of unpredictability in trying to answer that question. So this is not an administration that carries international law as its guiding star. This is not an administration that is likely to speak to or act in the interest of Palestinian rights, ending occupation. It is an administration that has spoken the language of making peace, not war. It is an administration that had Netanyahu, the Israeli premier, nervous enough at the very outset that he agreed to the exact same terms of a ceasefire that he had rejected for many months. So I think the way I look at it is to say round one was to the Trump administration. They got the first ceasefire. Round two, just now, has been to Netanyahu. He got them to agree to his terms because there is an agreed framework. This is really crucial. There's an agreed framework for carrying this forward, of which America was supposed to be a guarantor. And it included negotiations on further phases of releasing Israelis, of Palestinian prisoner releases, of relieving the horrendous circumstances in which Palestinians are living, deprived of food, fuel, water, electricity, medical supplies. They cut off the electricity, which ended the water desalination. So in phase two, Israel was supposed to negotiate its full military withdrawal and a permanent ceasefire. Israel refused to do that. For now, the US is aligned with Israel's shifting of the goalposts. People may want to look at that and say, hey, does that have implications for what the US is negotiating elsewhere? Round two to Netanyahu. I don't think we can make a clear determination yet of whether this is the end of the story, because one of the things that happened just before this resumption of the Israeli strikes was that we had a leak that was then confirmed that one of the American senior envoys, Adam Boehler, was speaking directly to Hamas. So this is an administration that also did some things out the box. I think this really got the Israeli side nervous because the Hamas spokespeople were making clear that actually they are not the obstacle. They're not insisting on governing Gaza. There is a long-term truce that's possible. This envoy was convinced of that. For now, they have desisted from that on the American side. As I said, the Israelis won this round. And perhaps that is the shape of things to come. And it will just be more death, destruction, turning more of the international community against Israel, making it more uncomfortable for Israel's allies, whether they're in Europe or in your region, in Asia. But for now, Israel will go forward despite the domestic opposition, despite the international opposition, but with the support of a US, which is, again, isolating itself internationally. And we saw that this week in the UN Security Council.
Yeah, Daniel, as you said, and as Mr. Netanyahu says, from now on, negotiations will only take place under fire. How does this stance impact the likelihood of Hamas being willing to release Israeli hostages or even enter any agreement with Israel under these conditions?
That may be a little bit of a red herring because for long, long months, talks did take place under fire, right? The 42 days of the ceasefire was the exception during this last period. So I think both sides are prepared to conduct negotiations under fire. What I don't think we're going to see is this idea that the Israeli military operations are going to generate a leverage where Hamas will say, oh, okay, we'll concede all our positions. Because, and this is hard for people to absorb, but these are the facts. The Hamas position is not just a Hamas position. It's what was agreed by the parties, including the US, which is a permanent ceasefire and a full Israeli military withdrawal. And a governance for the day after. Israel is saying no to any Palestinian governance. Israel is saying no to withdrawing. It just actually re-established a corridor which cuts off one half of Gaza from the other. That's the news of the last day. It is saying no to any ceasefire. So those are terms that no party could accept and that, in fact, the international mediators had previously not accepted. So I don't think this is going to fundamentally shift the terms here. What it is likely to do is get Israel deeper in the mud of an ongoing conflict, it's likely to make the release of the Israelis ever less possible. It's likely to lead to Israel being in the dock internationally for further committing war crimes, the collective punishment of Palestinians, the attempt to forcibly displace Palestinians en masse. It's not going to bring peace any closer. It's going to make the surrounding states ever more unable to have those relations with Israel, unless something happens to pull us out of the morass. The obvious thing is that the US puts its thumb on the scales of peace, not war. But there are other ways that Israel may be held accountable internationally over time.